Hello, everyone. I'm Jules Aubry-Deblic, political advisor at the European People's Party, and on behalf of the EPP, welcome to this new series of discussion with our national leaders and precisely our EPP finance ministers to discuss a major current topic, recovery. Today, we are really very glad to have with us Mr. Vincent Van Peteghem, Deputy Prime Minister of Belgium and Finance Minister. Minister, thank you so much for taking the time and joining us today. If I may,
Always pleasure.
thank you so much. If I may, Minister, a few words about you. You are a member of the CD&V, a Belgian political party which is member of the EPP family, and you are locally elected in your city of De Pint in Flanders as mayor, as we say in French, bourgmestre as well. You joined the Belgian federal government in October 2020, becoming also deputy prime minister in charge of public finances and also fight against tax fraud. In light of these duties, you represent your country at the Eurogroup and also ECOFIN Council, meaning that you are at the heart of European political dynamics when it comes also to EU recovery. Few words on EU recovery, if I may. Last year, EU institutions, backed by the willingness of member states to pool their efforts, pursued a timely course of action and designed the EU's largest ever stimulus package, with a total of around 2 trillion euros to help rebuild a greener, more digital and more resilient post-COVID-19 Europe. Next Generation is a more than 800 billion euros as a temporary recovery instrument to help repair our economies. Finally, and here we are, the Recovery and Resilience Facility, the centerpiece of Next Generation EU, which has made available more than 700 billion euros in loans and grants to support investments and reforms undertaken in EU countries. Belgium's Recovery and Resilience Plan, which has been positively assessed by the Commission and the Council, will be financed by 5.9 billion euros in grants, with a particular focus on investments that support climate and digital objectives. So if I may, Mr. Minister, a first question. Generally speaking, what does the so-called EU recovery mean for you as a political leader and also for your country, Belgium?
Well, I think the recovery and resilience fund is a really interesting thing because it really helps us to make our country as well future-proof, and that's really important for us. We're a very small, open, and export-driven economy, and therefore it's really of interest that we focus on the challenges that are ahead, and these challenges we have, of course, in digital, but also in green. And the national plan that we made is really focusing on that sustainability, is also focusing on that shift towards digital. We put more than 50% green investments in our national plan, and more than 24% that will also contribute to the digital transition. Moreover, what is important for me is that the RRF actually shows that we're not making the same mistake and the mistakes that we have made in the past. You remember after the financial crisis, focused a lot on austerity, and it was an austerity-based recovery actually after this previous financial debt crisis, which has a very negative impact on our investment rates, a negative impact on our growth, on our jobs, on our production. And now we're actually focusing on a growth-based recovery, which is very important, where we do and focus both on these investments, but also focus a lot on the structural reforms that are necessary. And therefore, I think this is really an important tool that we have today in the recovery after the COVID crisis.
I was wondering, Minister, what are some challenges you experienced regarding the RRF?
Well, as you know, we are a federal state, which means that we need to work closely, of course, with our regions. That's not always that easy, but it also was a challenge because we really have a bottom-up approach. It was not a top-down approach, as I've seen in some countries. We worked really via a bottom-up approach where we work together with the regions and of course also with the federal state to make our recovery plan. Everybody has its own competences. There are different responsibilities, also different challenges. But we now know, and that's of course also an interesting point, is that each of the proposals, each of the projects in our national plan actually give an answer to the challenges each region has, and is really tailor-made according to the needs and challenges each region has. Another challenge for me in the recovery plan, I was talking about that balance between the investments and the reforms. It's of course also the investments, that's something that you can set up quite quickly and you can implement and you can start doing it. With the reforms, that's of course something more difficult that requires some more time, also because of course Europe is expecting long-term structural reforms, and therefore it's not always that easy. There's a timing difference between, on the one hand side, the investments you do, and on the other side, the reforms. But I'm 100% convinced that they are both necessary to be successful.
Thank you so much for that. And entering maybe more into practical information to be shared with our audience, what are the main elements of your national Belgian recovery and resilience plan?
Well, that's actually, well, we made our national plan based on a couple of elements. One element were, of course, the regional recovery plans that were made by each of the regions. We also, of course, looked to our company-specific requirements and our government agreement, because we started last year in October, was also, of course, an important input for our national plan. And our national plan was actually built around 6 axes, which of course, and then they all had a B in front of them. So it's be sustainable, be mobile, be productive, be inclusive, and be digital. And there is also a huge focus on the composition of our public finances, where we focus a lot on the importance of spending reviews. The other 5 axes, I think they're quite obvious, but so be sustainable, of course, it's about the climate change and how we can boost innovation there. Be digital is, well, how can we facilitate the digitalization transformation that really is accelerated by the COVID crisis and that we need to support further. There is the be mobile, focusing, of course, on the mobility and on the infrastructure that is so important to also make that change towards sustainability and well, if you look to the numbers and the investments we do in our infrastructure, Belgium is not or doesn't have a great track record on this, so we really are investing in it as well. We then still have the be inclusive, of course, to enhance our inclusiveness, and be productive, because we really want to focus and to work towards a future-driven and future-proof economy.
Thank you very much. You were talking about the next challenges and reforms, and this can also lead to think about the future, generally speaking, of EU economic governance, since we know that important debates will take place between EU leaders in the coming weeks. And what about EU fiscal rules? It's a very important issue. How do you see its review?
Well, it's indeed a very interesting and important discussion, because it, well, as I said before, we now really need to focus on a growth-based recovery, and these fiscal rules can also help in that focus and that goal that we have today. Of course, due to the crisis, we have our general escape clause, which gives governments really some flexibility. That they can spend and can support their economic recovery. But of course, by the end of 2022, this general escape clause will be deactivated, and we will have to go again to that budgetary framework we used to. And first of all, in that whole context and in that whole discussion, for me, it's important that we really have clear rules, and that there is a framework, and that framework actually focus on that sustainability in the medium term and the long term, and that should be a key priority. But of course, on the other hand, we also know that it will be important that there will be a focus on how can we invest more, because I also explained before that our investment rate dropped down after the financial crisis because it was a really austerity-based recovery, and we need to find ways how we can support within that budgetary framework, how we can support and stimulate governments to increase their public investments. And that's really a key issue for me, a key priority in that whole discussion on the fiscal rules.
You regularly mention the dimension of investments, and according to you, Minister, will the EU RRF funds be enough for the recovery, also in terms of investments? And maybe at a later stage, if you want to talk about the very important, truly European ambition of green transitions, do you think it will be enough for the recovery?
Well, I think first of all that the RRF was a very and is a very welcome stimulus to the investments and the reforms that we are intent to take in the coming years in order to make our economy future-proof. So I think that it's important, and thanks to this swift creation of some temporary crisis support measures, that we will be able to get that recovery on the right track. So that's clear. But on the other side, it's also clear that we should not rest on our laurels. We have still a lot of challenges ahead of us. You're talking about climate, you're talking about the transition to green. We also have the turbulence as we see today on the energy market, on the real estate market. We have our aging societies. All these challenges were there already before the COVID crisis as well. So I'm really convinced that we should further reform. In Belgium on our agenda, we have some important reforms, like, for example, the pension reform, the tax reform, also the labor market reform. These are important goals that we have, important structural reforms that are needed, because as already indicated, and which is also a clear goal of our RRF, it's not only about the investments, it's also about making structural reforms. They're actually two sides of the same coin. We should really take the opportunity of the pandemic crisis to reform our economies now and to make sure that they are future-proof and that they are ready for the next generations.
Yeah, it's true. And coming back, if I may, about green transition, what is the Belgian position on the new EU targets and when it comes to reaching climate neutrality? Your country is really on this track, isn't it?
Of course, and it's clear that we want to achieve our goals of climate neutrality by 2050. That also means that we will need to do more green investments. And therefore, we definitely have to have extra efforts and make additional efforts to do both in the public and especially in the private sector will be required. So we need to really successfully mobilize sufficient resources, not only in our own budget, but also in the private financial market, to find investments that can actually help that transition. Now, in order for the private money to get actually channeled, towards these green investments, we of course need to have some clear strategies, some clear rules. If we want to convince the private sector to invest, then I really think that it's important that everybody gets the correct information, that investors, both the large one but also the small ones, will get the right information, that they know what are the green investments that we need to do, and what exactly a green investment is. It's about the taxonomy, of course. You probably already heard of it, that we make a good classification, but also we need to urge companies as well to disclose the information needed for investment to make well-informed sustainable decisions. And of course, the government should also tax emissions more so that investment in climate infrastructure becomes more profitable as well for the private sector, which will then, of course, also reduce the public costs. And in Belgium, we recently launched some interesting ways to do that. For example, we decided to tackle the energy refurbishment of our public buildings, where we really set up a kind of a project and a way that the private sector can also invest in the renovation efforts that are needed in our public buildings. But we also, for example, have another tool that is our transformation fund, which is also providing support to companies that are making that shift towards more green and sustainable investments and to more green and sustainable business plans. Well, we are also supporting them in the way how they are organized, and we finance actually that transition that is necessary.
Thank you. It's very interesting to also have very practical examples. And my last question, if I may, would be to ask if you could finally give us some flagships examples, in other words, really concrete projects that will be implemented in your country with the support and thanks to EU funds and with this whole recovery package now.
With pleasure, and I'm going to provide a combination of investments and reforms. I think that's the nicest example. As you know, we Belgians, we are very attached to our cars. We have a whole system throughout the last decades, which has a very generous system of tax deductions for company cars. And what we actually did is we used this as a lever to actually green our mobility. So one thing, and that was a big reform, is that we only are going to support carbon emission-free company cars. So the system of the tax deduction still exists and still will exist in the near future, but we will only apply it on carbon emission-free company cars, electric cars, which will then, of course, have a significant effect on our CO2 emissions and on the reduction of these emissions. So that's one part. That was the reform, which was very positively welcomed by the public and also by all the political parties here in Belgium. And on the other side, which is of course also important if you have electric cars, that you also have charging stations, and these charging stations at home but also at work are also stimulated to install, and we used the resources from our RRF to actually finance these install of the charging stations that will be installed with or in companies, but also at people's houses. So that's also a way to be sure that our infrastructure, the infrastructure then of charging stables, charging station, excuse me, is big enough to actually also support that transition to CO2 neutral or emission-free company cars.
That's very clear. Thank you so much, Minister Van Peteghem. It was important for us talking about recovery to start from the broader picture, EU recovery in general, and then to see what it practically speaking means for a country like your country. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today and for this discussion on recovery. I wish you good luck for the upcoming debates with your European partners and also within the political family of the EPP. And for all our viewers, see you soon for new exchanges with European leaders, ministers on this key challenge, how to make our member states and Europe stronger in this post-pandemic era. Thank you so much, Minister.
Thank you very much, and see you soon.